here to talk to you about their experiences of covering Black Lives Matter. First, if you want to see the full bios of the panelists, they're online. But first, we have Omar Jimenez from the CNN. Then we have Karen Attiah from the Washington Post, Madison Carter from WKBZ, BW in Buffalo. And Madison, by the way, is also the president of the National Association of Black Journalists chapter in Buffalo. And Molly Henderson Fisk from the LA Times, who is one of, I believe, the LA Times only reporter who's down on the border, where she has been for about 8 years. So Molly, why don't we start with you talking about your experience in covering Black Lives Matter. And I want to start with you because, and then I want to go to Omar, because both of you have some really dramatic experiences of what it was like being a journalist on the front line of this story. Could you talk about what you went through in covering this story?
That's right, and thanks for having me. So I was sent as a national reporter to Minneapolis with one of our staff photographers, Carolyn Cole, and we were covering some of the protests in some of the same places that Omar and his team were at the 3rd precinct, and then later at the 5th police precinct, and that's where we had our interaction with police. We knew going into it there was a large protest going on, a peaceful protest, a lot of people sitting at the intersection in front of the police department there, and that's when police appeared, and they made a small appearance and then backed off, and then Minnesota State Patrol came, and they had used pepper spray and tear gas and rubber bullets and pursued a group of us, television and print reporters with big cameras. It was obvious we were journalists. And I got hit in the leg with what I believe were rubber bullets and the tear gas and all that was in the air. And Carolyn was sprayed in the face with pepper spray and couldn't see. And so we had to flee. She couldn't see, and I had a hurt leg. And we had to go over a brick wall and run and take cover and eventually seek treatment.
Now, first of all, how's Carolyn doing? I know that she was pretty badly injured. How is she doing now?
She's doing great. We actually were just out reporting yesterday. So we've been reporting. She took a little break to go to the hospital and get treated. Her eye had to recover especially, and she had some other injuries. But yeah, I reported every day since it happened. I did not stop, in part because I felt like it was important to not let that stop us.
I know, Molly, in a piece about this, you talked about the fact that you've reported from Afghanistan, you've reported from Iraq and a lot of places, but you've never been through what happened in Minneapolis. What do you think happened there? Why were journalists targeted?
Yeah, I've reported from a lot of countries, Egypt, Mexico, that are known for having, police cracking down, not just on the people, but also on journalists. And I've witnessed some of that to local journalists there, and it's a lot worse in some of those countries. So I did want to put it a little bit in perspective. But the normal rules of engagement that I had, reported based on in other parts of the United States during other protests, for instance, during Ferguson, and there was tear gas in Ferguson, obviously, too, and that the press got some of that, but I personally was not chased by police there. I was not shot at with rubber bullets, directly targeted. So it feels to me, well, obviously things have changed.
Let's go to Omar so we can hear his story, and then we'll come back and have an additional conversation. Omar, let's talk about what happened to you. I mean, it's something that a number of people, I guess tens of thousands of people know about because they saw it happening or sort of unfolding live. What happened? If you can walk us through what was going on with you in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so like Molly, we were in sort of what had been multiple main spots of either protests or gathering spots for this story. So in this particular morning, we were right outside the third precinct for Minneapolis police. It was a precinct that had previously burned in nights before as protests descended on it. So it was a really central point of this story. And my crew and I were assigned to start in the early morning, as we're often tasked with doing. So we got there at around 3 o'clock in the morning. And when we got there, what we saw was there was no law enforcement presence whatsoever. Buildings were burning, people were running through the street, and that's what began our day. So we've been doing that for a few hours or so. And then within a matter of minutes, as the sun was beginning to come up, police swarmed, state police, local police, National Guard, you name it, law enforcement swarmed, cleared everyone out, and there was this sort of silence, so to speak. No protesters in the street. We were outside of the police line. The police had created a line around that block that had been literal anarchy in the hours before. And we had done about one report, I believe, and we were in the middle of our second report when all of a sudden it seemed like a woman, a protester, it's hard to say, came running out from behind their line towards us. They started chasing that woman. Next thing we know, we're surrounded, my crew and I, myself, my photographer, Omar Jimenez, and my producer, Bill Kirkos, and our security, and we're surrounded. I'm continuing to try and report because my photographer's filming this apparent arrest that's happening in front of us. And the next thing I know, I hear from Minnesota State Patrol, you're under arrest. No words spoken prior to that at all, just you're under arrest. And that is something, even in my few years as reporting, was the last thing that was possibly on my mind could have happened in an American city in the middle of Minneapolis. And so after that happened, there was still, I think, a sense of shock of me continuing to try and report. They took my microphone, they walked me away. My photographer, Omar Mendez, credit to him, kept the camera rolling as long as he possibly could, knowing that they were likely going to come to him in the minutes after that. And I think what we saw unfold, and part of why it was so captivating to so many people as I watched it back, was that the camera never stopped rolling, even in the hands of my photographer. The police officers, as they took it away, you could physically see it was in their possession as their boots were walking on the ground. At one point, the camera was placed on the ground, and all you could see was just us as we were being led away in handcuffs. So it was a very surreal scene. Obviously, it reverberated in places across the world. And depending on what lens you looked at it through, whether it was a community perspective, a Black community perspective, or even a journalism perspective, I think it was rattling to a lot of people, even outside of just what our crew experienced personally that day.
You know, it's surprising that it was happening, and I think you referred to that earlier, here in the United States, which should be a bastion of press freedom. How long were you in custody, and how were you able to get out?
Well, we were in custody for about an hour and a half in total, in cuffs the entire time. And I mean, we were lucky in the sense that we had this huge organization behind us in CNN that, one, they saw it happen immediately on live television as it played out. And so they were already trying to make calls. And from that point on, they were trying to contact the governor's office, the state patrol, to try and figure out what exactly was going on, as we were too, but we just were in cuffs and didn't have our phones with us. So we were put in the police van. We sat there for about 30 minutes, and then we were driven to the police station where we sat still in the van for about 45 minutes. Then we were placed on a bench, sat for a few more minutes, and then we were told to go. Now, the interesting part about that, at least to me, once it was over, was that this was an opportunity now for the Minnesota State Patrol to say, oh, well, we messed up, you know, mea culpa, let's move on. But instead, what they did is they put out a statement saying, well, we were just trying to verify that they were reporters, which, look, I'll give it to them in the first 5-10 minutes. Fine, you don't know what's going on. But we sat in that police van for about 30 minutes or so in the beginning. You could have, outside again of our camera crew, credentials and all that stuff, you could have turned on any TV. You could have gotten on Twitter. You could have Googled me. You had my credentials. There were a lot of things that missed opportunities that I think they had to where that excuse made no sense whatsoever. And then what really clicked is that, well, if this wasn't filmed, if this wasn't clear as day for the world to see how my interaction went with police and how I treated them despite this scenario, my account would have been now in question against the account of the police officers, where I would have said, hey, we weren't doing anything. We were just doing our job as we have been over the course of the past few days. And they would have put out a statement saying, well, we didn't know they were reporters. And so I think that is the crucial portion of it journalistically, at least for me, to where we were lucky that we had a camera on us the entire time and the world could see what we would not dispute. But that we know is not the case for 99.9% of these interactions.
Well, thanks, Omar. And I want to return to the whole question of press freedom in a minute after I bring in Karen and Madison to talk about their coverage. But before I do that, it's a good point to say that, again, to thank everyone for tuning in, and also to thank the National Association of Black Journalists, which is the oldest, the largest organization of journalists of color in the world, as well as to thank IPI, the International Press Institute, the oldest journalism organization that's devoted to press freedom in the world, and thank them for bringing us together to have this conversation. I want to remind everyone that please, if you have questions, to put the questions in the Q&A or the chat area, and we'll get to it. Karen, why don't we bring you in at this point to talk about, thankfully, you were not in the middle of the drama, and you weren't injured or arrested during this process, but talk about how you were able to cover in the area of your responsibilities, how you were able to cover the Black Lives Matter and the protests.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. So, just to make a distinction, I'm not sitting on the news side. I sit on the opinion section, the editorial section of the Washington Post. So, meaning I have the luxury of having an opinion about what's happening and about what's going on. And, the ability to, at least, from my perspective, as reasonably informed as possible, to call things out for what they are. And if that means, saying something is racist, saying something is racist. And I'm really, and I just want to say, it's an honor to be here with Omar and Madison and Molly. And seeing what happened to Omar was one of the first indications to me that we were entering a perilous time, and that this notion, as we've said before, the US has these norms of protecting press freedom, and to a certain extent, I don't want to necessarily say that, our bodies and our safety are more important than non-journalists and civilians, but it just flies in the face of what we've preached, particularly to other countries, for decades, as far as protecting freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the freedom to report. So, and unfortunately, Omar wasn't the only Black journalist to be assaulted, arrested, even after identifying themselves. So it just spoke to a level of impunity from the police forces across the country. And it just spoke to, I think, this, and from my perch, I think one of the first pieces that I wrote actually about Minneapolis was kind of this satire, looking at how we would cover this if we were another quote unquote country. And it's these issues of state security force impunity, violence, not police brutality, but extrajudicial killings, I would argue. I think in those early days after George Floyd's murder, it made us, and with the coronavirus happening, it just made us look so much like some of the places that, again, much treasure and effort has gone into, America being the one to look down upon, frankly. So at that point, I had no idea that it would devolve to the level of, again, multiple rounds of journalists being being harassed, being targeted. And I just wanted to say, like, this, to a certain extent, I mean, I think we like to say that this isn't what America does. This isn't what America does to journalists. And I'm still struck by, I don't know if folks have read it, but Dorothy Gilliam's book, Trailblazer, the first Black woman reporter at the Post who was reporting during the civil rights time. And if you read her memoir, they were dispatched to the civil rights movement and protests in the Deep South. It was dangerous to be a Black journalist. It was dangerous to be a journalist, period, because the government, the people in power, the white power structure, the white supremacists did not want what was happening to get out. And she recalls how one of her colleagues was beaten so badly that he had injuries for the rest of his life and eventually died from them. So it's this notion that it's always been a safe place to report and to challenge, especially challenging issues of racism. You know, I like to say state sanctioned violence, white supremacy. It's always been dangerous to challenge and report on white supremacy and racial inequality. And I think, you know, while people are risking their life and limb literally to do that in the streets, it's somewhat dangerous online to write about these things. You know, I've been subjected to, plenty of journalists have been subjected to death threats, intimidation, harassment. I don't think I've ever seen anything like the level I've seen in my inbox and coming to my phone. So we're definitely targets when we do this sort of work. And so I think in some ways, just like COVID, it is a question of our safety reporting during this climate. But at the same time, it's our jobs. And luckily, as Omar said, all of us, I think, on this panel have powerful legal protection, physical protection. There are many freelance journalists who don't have that. And you know, I hope as we go through that we really are taking these questions of our safety very seriously.
Karen, I wanted to ask you, in talking about press journalists, it's obviously very deeply interesting issue that we talk about in a bit. And I'm glad you mentioned Dorothy Gilliam, who is one of the most outstanding former presidents of NABJ, one of our organizers today. But one of the things that you do in your job at the Washington Post is to bring in voices from around the world into the American ecosystem, if you will. What were they telling you? What were you hearing from people around the world? And what are you still hearing about what's happening in this country?
You know, it's intriguing. I know, you know, we're speaking about this in the context of the United States, but this is literally one of the largest global movements in history, right? And the idea that, you know, from Memorial Day until now, that it's become literally, you know, a global protest movement where, you know, in the UK, you're seeing statues of enslavers coming down. In the Middle East, you're seeing the challenge to the kafala system to, you know, basically like establish sort of slavery. You know, you're seeing really, and I think that's what this gets to, and what I'm seeing in submissions that are coming in. It's sort of like, you know, what we're challenging here in the States is again part of this global, you know, order, which puts white Western countries on top. And I think it's really leading many people in other countries to examine global anti-Blackness, because that is a global phenomenon. It's leading people to think deeply about even, you know, Africa, thinking about the EU, I think recently said Black Lives Matter. And it's like, the question is, well, what about the African migrants that are drowning in the Mediterranean, you know, as a matter in some ways of policy with Europe? And it's really, I think it's almost like the W.B. Du Bois, like the color line, the global color line is being examined and challenged. And so I think that, you know, I think that's part of it. But I also think, frankly, you're seeing a lot of people in a lot of countries who are saying, my God, America, you're still grappling with these issues that have been around for centuries. And, you know, a lot of countries are also seeing that, why, I think, why is this still a problem? Why is this still happening? And I've had people, again, same thing from other countries, Middle East, just saying, we're sending you solidarity, support, you know, tips on how to, I mean, not for me, but tips on how to deal with tear gas from Palestine and other places. There's something that is resonating, I think, across the world with the struggle to be free, frankly. So yeah, we'll just have to see how it all shakes out, I think.
Let's bring Madison in. Madison, you're the president of NABJ in Buffalo. What has your coverage been like? How have you been covering as a television journalist at WKBW in Buffalo?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here. Hopefully I can bring a more unique perspective. I know a lot of people came up through local news, but I definitely think that covering these things locally is different than covering it nationally, right? Because you know everybody. This is your community. You live here, you work here. And so I remember it was May 30th was our first night of protests here. And I remember the lead up into it and listening to some of the rhetoric online. Buffalo is an interesting town. It's very small, it's very friendly at times. Nothing like this has ever happened in Buffalo. It's a very racist town, and that's not a secret. But the racism just kind of sits on the surface and stays there. And so I remember watching what was going on online, and I was saying to my bosses, I was like, this protest that's happening on Saturday, it's not going to go so smooth, I don't think. And they were like, oh, really? And I knew it because I was in Charlottesville during the Unite the Right rally back in 2017. So it was a similar feeling. And so I went out that night, things got choppy, wasn't good. And, I went on, I had a 75-minute live shot. Our 11 o'clock news went into, the middle of the night. And I got home after, they started shooting the rubber bullets and the tear gas and this and that. And it was a crazy scene. And the one thing that stood out to me, the one thing from everything that happened that night was that I was the only Black reporter out of all the TV stations out there. And I tweeted that out. I tweeted it out at 2 a.m. I'm like, I just got home and this is the one thing that's just not sitting right with me as a journalist and as a president of this Black organization here, because we have worked. I've given these newsrooms the resources. I got here and I was the only Black anchor at all 4 stations. And I was like, nah, that's not right. This city's 40% Black. We can't have that. So I was like, you need help, you need help, you need help. I got you. So you have the resources, you have the tools, you have the journalists that can come out and cover this. So I'm like, where were you? And all the news directors and leaders, they were like, are you talking to me? And then everybody in my chapter, like, are you talking to me? And I'm like, yes and yes. I'm looking at all of y'all, like, where were you? And I'm looking at all the news leaders, like, did you run out of Black journalists tonight? Like, what happened? And it wasn't that only Black journalists can cover this story, right? You don't need to put the Black journalists on the Black story, no. But I was looking at the coverage that night when I watched it back, and it was like, the context was missing. Again, nothing like this has ever happened in Buffalo. So while everyone's sitting here and they start, looting and smashing windows, and you see others say, oh my gosh, the taco shop, you're never gonna get tacos again. The windows have been smashed in. And I'm like, oh snap, oh my God. Lloyd got busted out. But anyway, let me remind y'all why we're here tonight. And they're like, we wanna see it. And I was like, oh, you wanna see it? I was like, all right, I'll take you. We'll go look at it. But on the way over there, let me tell you why we're here tonight. Let me tell you what led up to this. And I think that is what I was missing. And that's what I needed some of the other stations. And I've talked to the other reporters since then, right? And they were like, oh, okay. And since then, I would teach anybody how to do this, how to remind people. But like, this is a moment that people aren't going to be very forgiving if we get the story wrong. You know what I mean? And so that's what really stood out to me that night in covering things locally. And also the other reporters, I will never forget this one reporter coming up. And when they started shooting rubber bullets, I was like, oh, snap, let's go. And she like grabbed onto my arm. Oh my gosh. She goes, whoa. And it was over. And she goes, that's the most action I've ever seen in Buffalo. Like, this is so exciting. And I was so mad. I was so mad because I'm like, this is exciting to you. I'm trying to figure out if my friend's going to go home tonight. I don't know. So I'm like, this isn't exciting to me. This is scary to me. And I remember the last question the anchor threw at me at the end of my 80-minute live shot was, like, how do you feel? And I just remember unloading, and I'm like, some windows are busted out. I might not get my taco next week, but I'm so relieved. I am so relieved that there are no dead bodies for me to talk to you about tonight. And I think that was the difference, and that's what stood out to me.
Madison, you mentioned Charlottesville earlier. How would you, if you could, compare what it was like being in the middle of that coverage and then being in the middle of this one?
Yeah, so let me tell you the truth. I was at NABJ, the actual night of the rally. We were in New Orleans, but I was there literally up until the day it happened, and then covering afterwards. And they kept coming back with these little protests and rallies, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot covering that rally. I really think Charlottesville was the genesis of this idea of outside agitators coming in, right? Because if you talk to any kind of historian or people who've covered protests, they're very local. You have your organizers, you have your leaders, and it's going to go smoothly because you trust these people in your community. But Charlottesville was the first time we saw people coming from outside, and they kept coming back. I was 20 years old covering Charlottesville. Just at a school in the small market. And I'll never forget one of the protests that popped up afterwards. I was the only one in the newsroom. And I went out and I was like, oh, we got to cover this. They're in the square. And I will never forget, I only had my phone on me. And I picked up my phone to start recording. And my hand was shaking, right? Because I'm like, here's this man, this racist in front of me. And I was scared. I've never, gone toe to toe with a racist before. I didn't know what to expect. And that made me angry again, because I'm like, why does this man have so much power? Why? And I found out racists are some of the friendliest people you'll ever meet. They're very kind, very, very polite. We're in the South. It was yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Yeah, I just believe I'm better than you. And that's it. But I think it just taught me a lot about how to deal with people coming from outside. They don't care about this town. They're going to tear it up. What kind of language to listen for, where to go, where to move, how to approach these people, how to be safe. So there were a lot of lessons I learned and I've taken from Charlottesville to my future reporting.
And that brings up a question about press freedom that I know Karen started talking about pretty deeply earlier. And let me go to Omar and talk about, Omar, the question of press freedom. CNN is all around the world. The CPJ, the Community to Protect Journalists, has what they call a press tracker, and IPI is a part of this press tracker in the United States, in which they have been tracking instances of press freedom violations. There are, I think, well over 70 already this year. I mean, how do you sort of reverse that in this country?
Well, in this country in particular, I mean, you only are the most powerful weapon that we have as journalists is the work that we do, of course. However, it comes down really to the people in power who have to then respect the craft that we do. So actually, what Madison was saying earlier about the stakes, or it might have been Karen, about the stakes of getting either things wrong or not. I think I should say this: the stakes of getting things wrong are very high, and then you have to have everything buttoned up as much as possible to give them as little a case as possible. And it is crazy when we're thinking about this within the context of the United States, because CNN is such a global organization. I would have conversations with Matt Rivers, who used to be over in China for us, and about a lot of his reporting was, he showed it on camera how he was being censored trying to cover certain stories. He showed how he was being followed by, he would say, oh, yep, that's someone from the government who's been following us for the past few days. He kept rolling as they would come knock on his hotel room door and ask, oh, let me see your press credentials in the middle of the night. And so that to me showed, one, the power from my perspective of the camera and trying to keep it rolling as much as possible, to have that evidentiary record to then give myself power and put it out there if the account that I'm bringing forward is questioned. Now, as far as, again, trying to remedy challenges of press freedoms, it's a tough question that is broader than just one reporter. It comes down to, again, an infrastructure and of organizations pushing their reporters and supporting their reporters under any circumstances and challenges to their freedoms. it comes down to solidarity amongst reporters ourselves. I mean, you see it play out most days, I would say, at the White House, maybe not every day. If a reporter is skipped over because the president or whoever does not want to call on that person, another reporter may step in and hand the mic to that person or ask that same question. And so there are things that we can do, because we have to understand that we do hold a lot of power in our organizations, in our voice. Whenever I step in front of a camera, whenever Karen puts out an opinion or writes one, whenever Molly gets out there, even Madison, we have a lot of power in what we bring to the forefront, because in a lot of cases, we're bringing things out there that the people in power don't want to be seen. And so we have to understand and know that we are bringing a lot to the table on top of things that are trying to be taken away from us.
Molly, let me bring you in on this, because you work on the border. On the other side is Mexico, where we've seen over the years an unprecedented number of journalists killed. You mentioned earlier being in Egypt, one of the countries that has some of the most, the most journalists have been incarcerated, and there have been many campaigns against trying to free the journalists, particularly in Egypt. Did you ever think that you would see the kind of violence against journalists on the street covering stories in this country that you've seen and aware of in other countries?
Well, you know, Karen made a point earlier. You know, obviously I'm a white woman, so my experience is shaped by that in this country in particular, but also overseas. So, you know, I had cited Ferguson earlier. I did not feel attacked by the police in Ferguson any more than anybody else who was in the crowd of protesters. But there were other reporters, like Wes Lowry got arrested. You know, Wes Lowry is Black. So, and he wrote about that experience. So obviously, you know, that's a difference. But I was on a panel last week with reporters from LA, and two things that I took away from that. One was I think it is really important, you know, Madison, the point you were making about who is out there reporting. And on the one hand, we have grappled with this in our newsroom. A lot of the people who are out covering the protests in LA are reporters were people of color, because we have a good number of I shouldn't say a lot of, because that's relative, but a good number of reporters who are Black and people of color who want to be out, or that's their job on Metro. But there is a value, I think, to having white reporters at white bodies out there, because it serves the point that Omar is saying they did this to all of us, but they didn't do it exactly the same. I didn't get arrested, you know, so we can say that. I would like to know why Minnesota State Patrol handled things the way they did. And I also wanted to make the point that, you know, when Omar was describing all that stuff that happened to him, you know, he was being held in that van where who knows if it was cleaned for COVID. I don't know, that the station where he was held, when we were all in that tear gas, who knows what we inhaled with COVID. So that's not, I would not say that's the responsibility of protesters, because they can't control what's being shot at them, the gases and stuff. I would say that's the responsibility of the police, who know that there's a pandemic going on. So I'd like to know all that information. I'm trying to get that information from Minnesota State Patrol, but they have so far not disclosed information, not apologized. I'd like to hear from Omar, but they certainly haven't apologized to me. I'm filing a complaint. The ACLU has sued, and they haven't said anything except to back up what they did.
And if I can just jump in.
Yeah, I'm going to go to you, Madison, next. But I just wanted to mention that we're getting some really great questions that are coming in. I want to encourage folks to continue sending your questions in, and we'll be getting to your questions shortly. Madison, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point. I think from listening to Molly and Omar, and even my own experiences here, this idea of press immunity has just like disappeared. Like, I think, you know, I have so many privileges as a member of the media. I park on sidewalks, I walk into events without, you know, tickets, all these different things. And I had an experience here. I'm a type 1 diabetic, insulin dependent, and my car was parked from here to your front door. And a protest just popped up outside, just popped up out of nowhere. And I needed to get to my car, my marked car, to get my insulin. I was having a low blood sugar. I needed sugar, not insulin. And the woman wouldn't let me go. And I was like, no, I'm media. I need to get there. And long story short, she wouldn't let me go. I flipped out. I called the commissioner. I called the deputy commissioner. I called everybody I knew to get there. And I was just so devastated at that moment because up until then, I had amazing experiences with police. Police held off on moving in until I finished my live shot. You know what I mean? They helped me, protect me. They moved me behind their line. Like, I was like, this whole press against media thing is not happening in Buffalo because we're different. But the moment I stepped away from my white photographer, I wasn't a member of the media anymore. I was a Black woman claiming I was having a medical emergency. And that happened a couple days before what happened to Omar. And I remember I cried. I remember crying after watching what happened to Omar because I was like, there's nothing that we can do to escape our Blackness to people. Do you know what I'm saying? Like we're Black no matter what, in any circumstances, no matter what we're doing. And like, that was just so, I love being Black, but it was just so devastating to me, the way that we are viewed in any circumstance.
Madison, and I was going to get to the questions later, but someone asked a question that I want to, that goes directly to the point you just made, and I want you to address it, and then I'm going to go to Karen on the same question. You know, the questioner wanted to know about the nature of the threats received by female journalists. Are they different from threats received by male journalists?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. Again, I still, to this day, even after I put out that, I'm still the only Black reporter leading this coverage, still. So I don't know. So they're all other males, like male reporters and different things. So like, I am out there, and the threats I'm getting is just me saying I'm race baiting people, and that's all. I mean, I don't know that I'm getting, you know, severe threats, and I don't know if my male counterparts are really getting any kind of threats, but I've only had experiences like that.
As I go to Karen, I would add not just the threats, but the challenges of female journalists out in the field covering these stories. Do you think that they're any different than what we see of male colleagues?
Yeah, and you know, in this moment, you're speaking to a Black Karen on this panel, given the discourse now about you know, white women displaying behaviors that endanger Black people and people of color. You know, there are studies that in general, Black women online receive way more abuse than white women and white men and Black men. And I think, you know, as I said before, in this moment, there is, like I said, I'm literally receiving racist abuse on my phone right now as we're speaking, for some, you know, comments that I've made about race and racism and white women's place in that, in this, you know, white male dominated society. And
Karen, we sort of tiptoeing around this. I know we've referred to it. Can you talk about what happened recently where that brought an onslaught of criticism and comments against you? Can you, if you can take you know, a little bit and tell us about that?
So again, going back to the whole Karen phenomena right now, which I never would have expected. I grew up thinking my name was quite boring, and now it's become really this kind of language that we have again for how like race and gender really operate, and how, you know, white female privilege again can help to uphold this kind of racist matrix that we have in this society. So I think it was it was trending. Another Karen was trending for something, and I said, and I've been sort of responding to. I wrote a piece about how Karen isn't a sexist or a racist slur. It is gendered. It speaks to a particular type of choice, I think, that white women employ when it comes to dealing with inconvenient Black people in their space, or Black people just being, breathing in their space, and choosing to call the police, or, in the case historically of Emmett Till, call their white male family members to go and beat, kill, and lynch. So the tweet that I sent, I was responding to this idea that Karen is some sort of horrible, horrific slur that in some way is now the new N-word, which, is laughable, but then also just absurd and infuriating, and trivializes the very real violence that slurs really denote. They're accompanied with displacement, with violence, with death, with killing. So, I take minor offense to that comparison. And I said as much. And basically, in a moment of frustration, I basically said, and I laid out the history on Twitter from the Tulsa massacre, which in part was instigated by a white woman who had accused a Black man of assault falsely, and that led to basically the raising of Tulsa, and in which hundreds of Black people lost their lives, to Emmett Till, to these videos that we're seeing, to scores of white women in this country voting for Trump, who has committed to basically, rhetorically at least, waging war on people of color. So I just laid that out, that history of violence, frankly, out, and just said, what was my exact quote? We're only calling you Karen, despite this history. Like, we're not calling for revenge. That was it. Like I said, oh, lucky we're not calling for it. That was it. That was the tweet. That was it. And the Breitbarts and the Daily Callers and the Fox Newses of the world seized on that and said that I was inciting violence. And I took it down just because I was like, I just don't feel like dealing with the backlash. But I stand by this sentiment, right? It's not a statement of wishing for this. It's literally a statement of, just like Kimberly Patrice Jones from Minneapolis has said, we are just calling for justice. We're just trying to tell you to stop killing us. That's it. So it's turned into this whole thing. I got death threats, calls to a campaign to have me fired. And I said to, I said to people, I was like, if a white man said the same thing about Black people, about the Karen meme, they would have been applauded. They would have been the new, Robin DiAngelo. They would have been like, that's a real intellectual position grounded in history. But when I say it as a Black person, particularly as a Black woman, the R word, the retaliation word, that is outside of our norms of what Black people are supposed to say in the face of violence. We're supposed to be forgiving. We're supposed to be calling for justice and calling for peace. We're supposed to be calling for love, right? While there are boots on our necks. And I think, from that, it's just a reminder that, as we're talking about freedom of speech, it's very interesting that freedom of speech all of a sudden doesn't apply to me. And I feel like I said, this is a moment where if you're outspoken about challenging these things, you have a target on your back, at least online. But yeah, I had threats saying that they would put bullets in my head, that they would come try to find my family and make examples out of all of us. Keyboard warriors for the most part. But I think that, at the end of the day, still, this is a time to have these difficult conversations. Unfortunately, yes, it does mean that white discomfort puts us at risk, both professionally, not just, it's easy to talk about the quote unquote crazies out there, but I think even professionally as journalists, even within our newsrooms, we are voicing things that are uncomfortable. And I'm very aware of the fact that for many of us and many of our white colleagues who maybe never had to think about these things, it's almost more challenging to navigate the folks, white or non-Black colleagues who actually really think they're on the right side, and not just colleagues, but friends, family, whatever. And again, I think a lot of us have been called to be doing a lot of educating, like a lot of, can you recommend book lists and like podcasts, and or you're just dealing with not only discomfort but like a lot of white guilt, like I'm so sorry, and I'm but so there's a lot of emotional labor that Black people are being asked to do in this moment. It's not only like for folks and Omar and Madison, like trying to stay alive, literally stay free and safe, your body's intact, but it is also emotionally draining to constantly be navigating your Blackness. And on top of that, if you're a female, your femaleness. Also, some people have said that they're not going to do this. They're not going to, spend their time educating white folk right now, because it's a lot. It's a lot, and we're being called to fix and educate on a system, a racist system that we didn't create, right? Like this isn't our battle in that sense. So I agree with the sentiment again that this is also, the burden shouldn't only fall on Black journalists, particularly Black women, to do a lot of this heavy lifting. Race is also white, non-Black, other people of color, just like writing on like gender shouldn't just be a women's thing, frankly. And so this is a really, I think, trying time for a lot of us.
You bring up an interesting point when talking about some of the difficult conversations. Some of these difficult conversations, Karen, have also been happening in newsrooms. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we can, if I can go to Madison on this. Madison, if you can talk about the kinds of conversations that you've been having in your newsroom because of this.
This is a point I'm very passionate about, because I have been, agonizing over this for the past 4 months. Newsrooms, especially local newsrooms, were so shamefully unprepared for this moment that we're in right now. So unprepared. And now shame on them for putting Black journalists in the position that we are in right now. Karen was just talking about her tweets, and there are all these meetings all the time. So I understand there's a movement and there's a message behind Black Lives Matter, right? And I understand newsrooms saying like, we can't get behind Black Lives Matter. They're organizing a convention. They're planning to endorse a candidate. I get that, but they're throwing out the message along with saying we can't get behind that. And that's not fair to the Black journalists who are working in those newsrooms, right? I need to know that you think it's important. So then we tweet something out. So my page, I personally haven't used the hashtag or, said anything to that effect because of, that, but it's very clear where I stand on Black people, where I stand on including Black people in the narrative, having their voices represented, and pointing out mistreatment of Black people. That is very clear in anything that I do, any of my work. So when you're calling journalists in to have these meetings about their tweets and you're saying, oh, you don't represent the company well, hold on. You're using my work, my voice, my connections, my network, my brand, and you want to sit here and talk to me about how I'm representing you? So my mind has shifted. I'm sitting here now, I'm like, how are you representing me and my people and what's happening to us? Because I think that's the bare minimum that you owe Black journalists. What Karen said, we're living through trauma. Like every day I wake up and I am stepping into a traumatic situation from what I'm covering. So I think it's the bare minimum for companies to be able to represent Black and brown issues accurately. And when you call them out, when you say, I don't think we're doing this right, then journalists are called activists and not real journalists, right? Like, I'm like, activism and representation are two different things. So I think newsrooms are tying together too many concepts. They're not representing Black and brown people accurately, and they're also not taking any sort of criticism to advance. So we were so unprepared for this moment. Black people, this is my last point. Black journalists have been hired as props for newsrooms for decades, hired as decoration, right? we got a black one. Like I was the only black anchor, and oh my God, they waved that flag. We got one, y'all.
Yeah.
We got one.
It's like a
Hey,
Pokemon or
like,
something.
yes. They're like, y'all got one? No, because we got a black anchor. And so it was like almost like I was a prop. But then when those dolls, like Toy Story, you start talking, they're like, whoa, 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 whoa. So I call my kids, but the younger journalists that, I have the opportunity to mentor, I'm like, don't ever go into a newsroom as a prop. Like, you go in there and you have a responsibility to get what I said. We must get this story right. And so nothing I'm saying is radical, because I've talked to everybody in this market about how I feel. And I don't ever bring up a problem without a solution, right? I've had workshops. How can we fix this? And there are ways to fix this. But yeah, stop treating Black journalists like decoration. And then when they start talking, flip out.
Right.
That's
and if I just wanted to add one thing super
Sure.
quickly, it's just even this movement, even Black Lives Matter was founded and started by Black women. Even this I think we haven't talked much about like what has arisen in this moment in terms of the discourse, and the discourse about defunding the police, the discourse about questioning the justice system and the prison industrial complex, abolish the police. I mean, the OG Angela Davis. I mean, a lot of these ideologies and political thinking is actually Black women as well. And so it's like you see our newsrooms, as Madison said, they are struggling to like play catch up and struggling to understand like, whoa, where did this come from? And I think a lot of us are like, we've been telling you, like we've been writing about it before it was popular, right? And you still didn't give us the ear, the power, the resources, and now all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, like, which right. is all right, but again, it's just this. It's like you said, and I've said this even in meetings and stuff. Like we weren't ready for this. We'll do our best, but we weren't ready for this.
Karen, your comment brings up why organizers of this conversation have already started talking about having another conversation. So like people to stay tuned for that. But I promised that we'll get to some questions, and I want us to do that. Here's one question. This is to Omar. I live in Minneapolis, and I also covered the protests. The attacks on the press and journalists and constant insults rain on journalists. Does this send the wrong signals to dictators around the world?
And I think I would say right off the bat, I would say yes. I think there have been a lot of questions as to where America. It's one thing about how we deal with it internally, but America is looked to in many aspects, including press freedoms, about how far you can push things. I think that's the biggest thing. Where, sure, maybe if we were back here, well, we pushed it this way. A reporter was arrested, reporters were tear gassed, they were shot with rubber bullets, and the world didn't collapse. So if you're looking at that somewhere else, well, even by US standards, we can do this, and maybe we could push it even further. And so I think that is maybe the most dangerous aspect, at least to me, from a global perspective, looking in at the United States. Now, in regards to what example it sets, let's take an optimism route for just a little bit, because it all has been. I mean, look, it's a tough word out there, but from an optimist perspective, what I can applaud, and I hope sets just as powerful an example, is that despite what happened to myself, my crew, and so many others, we went right back out there. We wanted to show people that, look, you can keep throwing whatever you want at us, but what we are bringing to the table is more powerful than what you're trying to take away from us. And that actually was the only truly conscious thing I did that morning when we were taken into custody, was when we were walking out, I was telling my crew, saying, look, we got to go right back out to that same police line. We got to go right back and do the exact same work that we were doing, because this is part of the athlete mentality, but also just the journalist mentality, that I want to show them in the world that what they did isn't going to get in our head, isn't going to stop us. And so that's why I remember putting out a tweet. I specifically said, I usually don't try and go for posed pictures, but I said, hey, when we're set up a few minutes before going on air, I told my producer, take this picture, send it to me. And all I tweeted out was, and we're back. because that message to me was the most important one that we could send out to the world and say, all right, you did your best. Now we're going to come out and keep doing what we did like it didn't even matter. And so I hope those two examples, at least being sent out to the world, are battling in some respect, but of course, pushing the envelope of what is tolerated or what you can get away with is a concerning one. But I think the solidarity that the press showed me, that much of the country showed with me and my crew, is also something that can be looked at as an example as well.
Okay, great, thanks, Omar. Another question, and this is for Molly. Molly, what safety lessons do you have for other journalists who are experiencing some of the same conditions in which you worked in Minneapolis and elsewhere?
So I did hazardous environment training. This was some time ago, like back in 2005. So it's been a long time. But if you go to one of those trainings, I think those are extremely helpful. And they do have some that are funded by nonprofits specifically for freelancers. So it is a great resource. I know on the border, they do some of them. Some of the Journalism Association sponsor them, and they're really helpful. In the interim, because I hadn't done one of those more recently, I did do an American Red Cross just first aid training, which also has really come in handy, not just for hazardous environments like, like protests, but I was covering a scene of a shooting, and there was another shooting, and I was able to render first aid to someone who was there. So, those kinds of trainings I think are just invaluable just to have them. But also, we have this added layer of COVID now. And I was thinking, Omar, when you were talking about two things, some journalists, a freelancer and a journalist at LA Taco, who I was on this panel with, which is a smaller publication in LA. They had covered a protest, and the woman, the freelancer, got detained and separated off by police. And the gentleman, the reporter for LA Taco, went and intervened and showed the police copies of her work on his phone and was able to get her freed. And so I was just so impressed by that, by him being an advocate for her and helping her continue her coverage. And I haven't done that, but I thought that was a really amazing example to set of people advocating for each other and trying to help each other out. And I know in Minneapolis, some of the reporters, when we were running away, people were helping each other and rendering first aid. So there's that too.
We'll take our last question, and this is to Madison. I know, Madison, you're in television, so you can do this really quickly because we're just about out of time. It's a question of objectivity. How do journalists on the news side navigate issues of objectivity in legacy newsrooms?
You're going to get my producer treatment. They'll be saying rap, and I'm like, I got like 10, 15 seconds. Here's the thing. Objectivity. I got 30 seconds. Objectivity. People think objectivity is when you're talking about police brutality. They want objectivity to be talking about George Floyd's rap sheet. That's not objectivity. They think objectivity is talking about Black on Black crime. That's not objectivity. Objectivity is stating the facts, right? Letting you develop your own opinion based on what happened. It's not bringing in all these other aspects. So we can be objective and let you draw your own conclusions. And that doesn't mean bringing in all these other aspects, right? So I don't struggle with objectivity. I struggle with people's perception of what we're doing and what we should do.
Terrific. Yeah, that doesn't matter. Madison, I want to thank you. Certainly want to thank Omar, want to thank Molly, want to thank Karen for an enlightening conversation. And I think that's probably a good place where when the organizers of this discussion pick up with it at another time where they can pick up on the discussion. I would invite you to go to both the IPI and the NABJ websites. There's a lot of information there that would help you as journalists as you navigate this period that we're in, not just, as you heard, in this country, the United States, but around the world. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.